welcome to this very special video which is all about gauge. What it is, how you get it, and what to do when you can't get it. We're going to jump straight in and talk about what gauge is. Simply put, all gauge is how many stitches and how many rows you have over a certain measurement in your knitting. That's it. It's the basis for every design. So a designer will start with the gauge, and that's what they use to calculate every single measurement that you see in that knitting pattern, which is why when you have a knitting pattern, it also lists the gauge. It's how you can select your size that you want to knit in the knitting pattern, and how you know you're going to get those measurements if you've been able to match the gauge listed in the pattern. It ensures a really good fit, no surprises at the end where if like me you get things off the blocking mat in the past and your arm won't go down the sleeve because I didn't get the right gauge and just winged it. It's a really great way of being able to ensure that you're going to get a garment that fits, which is why it's so important to know what your gauge is and to try and get gauge if you want to match the sizes in the knitting pattern. So let's get really detailed and look at an example. Let's say we've opened our pattern and we've found the size that we want to knit, and we look at the gauge and it says that this pattern has a gauge of 22 stitches and 36 rows over a 10 centimetre square or a 4-inch square. It also tells us that it is knit in stockinette stitch in the round with 4mm needles, and the gauge is taken on a block swatch. So what do we do with that information in order to find our gauge? So first of all, the starting point. It's asking for 22 stitches and 36 rows over a 10 centimetre square. So if you have your fabric in front of you, your lovely knitted thing, and you take out your tape measure and lay it widthways across your knitting, if you have gauge, you will be able to find 22 stitches exactly within a 10 centimetre space. That's all that means, and it's the same for the depth. So if you were to put it lengthwise, you would count 36 rows within that 10 centimetre space. That's the gauge that this pattern is asking you to go to. So that's all those numbers mean. So the instructions tell us that the designers used a 4mm needle. Now you'll often see this listed as a suggested needle size because it's just that. It's a complete suggestion, it's what the designers used, and it's a great starting point for working out your own gauge. But the likelihood is I never get gauge straight away. I always have to change things up a little bit. So if you're one of those lucky people who tends to be able to get gauge quite quickly, then it's a great starting point. But don't expect to get gauge straight away. It's a suggested needle size for a reason, but that's a great starting point when you begin trying to find your gauge, and we're going to talk a little bit more about changing needle size in just a moment. So the next piece of the puzzle is knit in stockinette stitch. So this is what we're going to use to find our gauge. We're going to knit in stockinette to work out what our gauge is. You might find that in some patterns, several stitch patterns are listed with different gauges on there. That's because if a pattern has different stitch patterns in different areas, it can be really handy to know what our gauge is for each stitch pattern. Say for an example, our designer has used 4mm needles for both the stockinette part of a design, but also for a cabled section. If those cables are landing somewhere where it can really affect the fit, so say it's a cable sleeve, just because the designers used 4mm needles for both of those stitch patterns, and that's the gauge that they've based those measurements on, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be able to get gauge using 4mm needles for both stitch patterns. So you might swatch and find that the 4mm needles give you perfect gauge for the stockinette. If you just cast on straight away and not worry about the cable section, and you use your 4mm needles for your lovely cabled sleeves, you might find that you actually knit cables a lot tighter than the designer has, and therefore you're getting really tight sleeves, which, take it from me, someone who's knitted really tight sleeves a lot in the past, it's not fun. It doesn't lead to a comfortable garment, and it's definitely not one you're going to wear a lot. So I know adding an extra swatch to what we're doing isn't always the most fun, but in those situations it's really good to know if you're going to get gauge for all those stitch patterns or if you need to adjust things, and we're going to talk about adjusting to get gauge in just a minute. So now we're moving on to two slightly more controversial points. Not so much controversial, but I know these are two things I definitely ignored for a really long time, and they go a really long way to getting an accurate swatch and really working out what your gauge is. The first one is that in our example, it states that this gauge is taken off fabric that is knit in the round. If it specifies knit in the round, then you should swatch in the round to get an accurate gauge. I didn't do this for the longest time. I hated swatching in the round. It felt really clumsy, but it makes such a difference. It does for me anyway, because my purl stitches are definitely a lot looser than my knit stitches. So for stockinette stitch, knit in the round compared to flat is definitely different, and it's something that it took me a long time and several disasters to work out. So if it says there in the gauge instructions it's knit in the round, definitely knit it in the round, because you're going to get way more accurate results if you just take the time to do that slightly different swatch. And then the last piece is on a blocked swatch. Again, this is something I didn't do in the past. I have been known to try and eyeball my gauge while the swatch was still on the needles back in the day, and hence why I ended up with so many sweaters in the back of my closet that just didn't fit. So definitely take the time. If you're taking the time to swatch, you might as well pop it in a little bath, take it, dry it out completely, make sure the pins are out. If you pin your swatch, then take the pins off, have a nice relaxed dry swatch, and then take your measurements from there. So we now know exactly what gauge is and what we need to do based on the instructions that are in the pattern. So next, all you have to do is actually swatch. I know swatching isn't our favourite, and I'm not going to go over all of the details here, but we actually have a really handy video just on swatching, which I'm going to link above. So if you'd like to check that out, please do. And once you've got your lovely swatch that's nice and dry and blocked, we're going to look at taking measurements from that. So what happens then if we take our measurements, we get our lovely nice swatch out, and in that 10 centimetre square we measure our stitches and we measure our rows and we don't have gauge? What happens then? So there are a few different things that I'm going to go over in this video now, talk about how you can adjust your knitting to try and reach gauge. First one is change needle size. This is probably the biggest difference you can do to try and get gauge, and it's normally the thing that will solve it. So if you have your lovely swatch out and you take your tape measure, and in that 10 centimetre square, instead of 22 stitches like the pattern asks for, you have 24. It means your knitting's too tight, so it's a lot tighter than the pattern calls for. So you could try swatching again on larger needles. So you can go up one needle size, you might have to go up 2 needle sizes. Keep swatching, and I know it's a little bit of trial, but keep swatching in those different needle sizes and see what the outcomes are, and see if you can get closer to that gauge. And the opposite applies. If you measure your swatch and you have 20 stitches instead of 22, then your gauge is too loose and you need to maybe go down a needle size or 2. So try that out first, and a lot of the time that will solve your gauge issues, and then you're able to cast on and start knitting your lovely thing. If it hasn't solved it, another thing you can try and do is change the material of your needles. So this might seem a bit strange, but if you're knitting on metal needles and you're just having a lot of trouble getting gauge, try wooden needles. I know this particularly helps with row gauge if you're having trouble getting the right row gauge. It's surprising what a difference the two materials will make, but it could solve all your problems. So if you have both types of materials on hand for your needles, then try swapping between them and seeing how it affects your gauge, because it might really help. Third tip, which is something that I cannot do, but it might help you, is to change up your technique. So if you can knit both English style throwing and continental, then changing between the two techniques may really help your gauge. I'm an English style knitter. The only time I can knit continental is if I'm doing colour work, and beyond, for some reason beyond that I can't knit continental at all. So I don't find this particularly helpful to me, but it might to you. So if you can use two different knitting styles and you're just not getting gauge with one, try the other. It might really help, and it might just get you closer to that gauge. And final tip, if all else fails, try changing up your yarn. Different fibres will react in different ways, and they'll give you different gauge options. So if you're really struggling with a particular yarn, try something different, try a different fibre. Particularly worsted and woolen spun yarns can give very different results when it comes to gauge. I find woolen spun yarns are a lot more flexible than worsted spun. So if I'm swatching and I'm really struggling getting gauge and it's a worsted spun yarn, then I'll maybe try it up with a woolen spun, because I find that this can get me much closer to what I want for gauge. So that's the final tip that you might want to try if everything else is not going your way. So hopefully all those tips just really helped, and when you're swatching, you've tried those different techniques and you've managed to adjust your gauge and you've got your final swatch and all is well and you've got gauge. But what if you haven't? What if you do all that and you still can't get gauge? Or better yet, you've swatched, you've got gauge, and you're like, I don't really like the feel of that fabric. I did this other swatch that is looser, it's got a larger gauge, but I really like the feel of that fabric more. That's absolutely fine. You can totally work to a different gauge than is stated in the pattern if that's your preference. It just might be that you have to put a little bit more thought and a little bit more brain juice into the equation and do some maths. As I said before, the designers use the gauge specified in the pattern to work out all the measurements in the pattern. So if you are going to work to a different gauge, you can't expect to follow the size that you've chosen and get that same fit that you had before, because the maths are going to be off. But in that situation, you can totally do your own maths and work out what you need to do from there. So we actually have a ton of information on our website and on our blog that talks about adjusting knitting patterns to get the fit that you want. So I'm going to link those below and hopefully they'll help you out. But if you are having this issue, in a nutshell, what you're going to want to look for is decide what measurements you want your garment to finish with. So say you want a finished bust circumference of 120 centimetres and you've got 25 stitches and 10 centimetres in your gauge as opposed to 22 like the pattern is asking for. What you do in that situation is do 25 divided by the 10 centimetres and then you would times that by 120. This gives us a total of 300 stitches. So what you're going to look for then is have a look in the pattern and see which of the sizes gives you around 300 stitches at the bust, and that's the size you're going to want to knit instead of following the finished measurements in the pattern. It's a good way of doing it. The only thing I would point out is it's really good to double check all the other measurements there too and make sure that they're going to work for you as well. But that's a really good way of adjusting your gauge to a knitting pattern. It might just be that you have to knit a completely different size than you would normally pick out, but that's a really good way of starting to work out what you want to do with the gauge that you've got. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and I hope it's been useful for you. If you have any other questions or thoughts on gauge, please do share them in the comments below, and I'll link all the other videos and the blog post below so you can check those out for a little further reading as well. And I will see you next time for some more knitting tips. See you soon. Bye!